It wasn't the first time the courtroom went quiet for the wrong reasons. But this time it was different. This time the silence wasn't out of respect, it was out of presumption. The kind that fills a room like smoke. Heavy, thick, dangerous. Inside Department 105 of the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Every eye fell on the young black woman at the defense table. Not because she was powerful, not because she was loud, but because she was alone. Imani Brooks. Just 22. Dressed plain. Hair pulled back. No tears, no trembling. Just her and that invisible target they put on black skin in rooms like this. She stood accused of stealing an Audi A6 and resisting arrest. The charges sounded serious. Serious enough that the courtroom had already made up its mind. Judge Elliot Warren leaned back, half-lidded pen tapping rhythmically on the mahogany bench. "You think you're in debate club," he smirked. "This is a courtroom, not a classroom." Laughter, subtle but sharp. And the prosecutor, Dylan Mercer, white-polished, smug, didn't bother hiding his glee. But Imani, she didn't blink, didn't budge. Because when you grow up black and brilliant, silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And the script, it's about to flip. Imani Brooks was raised in the South Los Angeles neighborhood of Baldwin Hills, where the streets could switch from manicured to cracked with the turn of a corner. From the front porch of their duplex, she could see kids riding scooters past jacaranda trees, but just blocks away, there were squad cars parked like shadows that never left. It was a place where beauty and suspicion coexisted, like paint on peeling walls. Her mother, Clarice Brooks, worked long hours as a paralegal for a mid-sized criminal defense firm downtown. Clarice never made it past community college, but her mind was sharp, like a switchblade wrapped in velvet. She believed in two things hard, truth and hard work, and she passed both on to her only child. While other kids played video games or raced up and down sidewalks with popsicles in hand, Imani sat at the kitchen table under the ceiling fan, flipping through red stamp police reports and misfiled motions. Clarice brought them home not to entertain her daughter, but because they overflowed her briefcase. But the little girl was curious. She'd read the margins, spot the typos, and ask the questions no one else had time for. "Ma, why'd they ignore the camera footage?" Clarice would sigh, stirring the pot on the stove. "Because, sweet pea, the law ain't always looking for the truth. Sometimes it's just looking for something easy to believe." By age 10, Imani knew how to read deposition transcripts. By 14, she could explain how plea bargains worked and how they trapped the poor. At 16, while her classmates wrote essays about Romeo and Juliet, she wrote an annotated analysis of Gideon Ver's Wainwright. She didn't have a father. Not one she knew. When she asked, her mother's eyes always drifted toward the window. Let's just say he knew how to disappear. But she did have mentors. She had courtrooms. Clarice would sometimes bring Imani along on her lunch hour to watch trials. From the backbenches, the young girl observed how suits spoke louder than evidence, how some judges barely looked up when a black defendant entered the room. She noticed who got second chances and who didn't. She noticed how her mother's clients almost always wore orange. Even at that age, Imani never interrupted. She just watched, listened, absorbed. She remembered a day in middle school when a counselor asked what she wanted to be when she grew up. "A lawyer," Imani said confidently. The woman laughed not cruelly but dismissively. "Maybe a legal assistant," she offered. "Start with something achievable." Imani didn't argue. She simply never asked that woman for advice again. By high school, she was volunteering at a neighborhood legal clinic, taking notes for an old civil rights attorney who had long stopped believing in miracles but appreciated a sharp mind when he saw one. He once told her, "You've got the eyes of someone who's been told no 1,000 times and still walks like it's a yes." Imani took it as the highest compliment she'd ever received. But she also knew something else. Brilliance wasn't armor. Not when your skin was black and your voice was sharp. She learned quickly that power didn't like to be challenged, especially not by young black women who refused to nod along. And so she adapted. She learned to speak softly, but carry a library's worth of knowledge behind her eyes. She learned that being underestimated was a gift if you knew how to use it. And she did. Every time. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Friday cool and cloudy. She had just finished a late tutoring shift and was walking home when she noticed the Audi A6 parked crooked outside a liquor store. The door was wide open, the dome light on. It was strange, and part of her was tempted to just walk by. But something about it felt off. Not dangerous, just careless. She glanced inside, half expecting someone to shout, but there was no one. The engine was off. A wallet sat untouched on the passenger seat. So she closed the door. That was it. 2 blocks later, flashing lights, then voices, then hands. "Stop right there. Don't run." They didn't even ask questions. The first officer tackled her to the ground. She scraped her arm on the curb. When she tried to explain, they said, "Save it for the station." By the time she was processed and fingerprinted, they had already decided the story black girl. Fancy car, fled the scene, must be guilty. She asked for a lawyer. The one assigned to her was a soft-spoken woman named Louisa Tran. Kind, overworked, polite to a fault. But Imani could see it right away. Louisa was just trying to make it to Friday. She wasn't going to fight this. Imani had seen enough trials to know what was coming. They'd offer her a plea, say it would be easier that way. Less time, less trouble, less life. But that's not what she had been raised for. Clarice visited her the next day in county holding. Her face was tired, worn at the edges, but her voice was steady. "You all right, baby?" Imani nodded, bruised but intact. "I didn't do anything, Ma." Clarice touched her cheek. "I know. That's why you can't let them write the ending." And that was it. That was the moment the courtroom seeds planted over decades of injustice bloomed into resolve. She wouldn't just defend herself. She'd indict the whole system. Monday morning arrived with a gray sky over Los Angeles. The courthouse bustled as if nothing significant was happening inside its walls. To most, it was just another case, but to Imani Brooks, it was a battle for identity, truth, and survival. The courtroom was packed. Word had gotten around about the car theft girl who refused to take a deal. Curiosity brought people and attorneys on break law students, even a local reporter from a community outlet who'd heard whispers of a case that didn't sit right. Inside, Judge Elliot Warren took his seat, tall, clean-shaven, mid-60s. His reputation efficient, strict, and not particularly fond of self-representation. He glanced at the docket and tapped his pen like a man bored before the story had begun. The People vs. Imani Brooks. Grand theft auto and resisting arrest, he read, then peered over his glasses. Counsel ready. Prosecutor Dylan Mercer rose smoothly, adjusting his navy blazer. Mercer had made a name for himself prosecuting low-profile open and shut cases. He liked control, and he didn't like surprises. "We're ready, Your Honor," he said confidently. Louisa Tran stood slowly looking toward Imani. Before she could speak, Imani gently reached over and whispered, "I'll speak for myself, Ms. Tran." Louisa's eyes widened slightly, then she nodded and sat. "I will represent myself, Your Honor," Imani said clearly, standing with her hands clasped before her. Judge Warren blinked once. "You what?" "I waive my right to counsel and choose to proceed pro se," she repeated. Mercer chuckled, barely hiding it. "This is going to be good." Warren leaned forward. "Miss Brooks, this is not a school debate. These are real charges with real consequences." "I understand," Imani replied calmly, "and I'm prepared." The judge gave a long pause, clearly irritated. "Fine, so ordered. Let's begin." The jury was brought in 12 everyday people, 9 white, 2 Latino, 1 black woman in her 50s who looked directly at Imani with something between concern and curiosity. Mercer began his opening statement like a showman entering familiar territory. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said with theatrical flair, "this case is not complicated. On the evening of March 17th, officers responded to a report of a suspicious vehicle outside a convenience store. A young woman was seen near the car. That car, a 2018 Audi A6, had been reported stolen just 20 minutes earlier. When officers arrived, the suspect fled. They gave chase. They apprehended her. Her fingerprints were on the steering wheel. The arresting officers identified her. This isn't television. This is reality. The defendant was caught red-handed." He turned to the jury, smug. "This case is as straightforward as they come." He returned to his seat and Judge Warren nodded toward Imani. "Your opening, Miss Brooks." Imani stood slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom and paused. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She just spoke. "This case may look simple," she began, "but sometimes the simplest stories are the ones most misunderstood. I'm not here to make speeches. I'm here to show you that what seems obvious isn't always the truth." She returned to her seat, the moment brief but firm. The trial proceeded. First, Mercer called Officer Todd Carver, one of the arresting officers. White, mid-30s, neatly pressed uniform, he took the stand with confidence. "Officer Carver," Mercer began, "can you tell us what happened that evening?" Carver nodded. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle near Crenshaw and 52nd. My partner and I responded. We observed the defendant walking away from the car. When we approached, she ran. We pursued, caught her 2 blocks down. Was there any struggle? She resisted briefly, nothing serious. Did you identify her as the suspect? Yes, she matched the description. Black female, mid-20s, jeans, hoodie. Were her fingerprints found inside the vehicle? Yes, steering wheel and driver's side door. Mercer nodded as if the case were already closed. No further questions. Judge Warren looked to Imani. Your witness. Imani Rose walked slowly to the stand. Officer Carver, what time did the report come in? Approximately 8:40 p.m. And where were you at that moment? On patrol in the area. Do you have GPS records of your patrol route that night? He hesitated. That would be in the department's logs. Has the prosecution submitted those records to the court? Carver looked to Mercer. Mercer stiffened. We didn't believe them necessary. Imani turned to the judge. I request the GPS records be submitted as evidence. They are standard documentation. Judge Warren sighed. The court will request them. Continue. She turned back. Officer Carver, did you see me inside the car? No. Did you see me touch the car? No, but no further questions. She returned to her seat. Mercer looked irritated and for the first time unsure. Next came the fingerprint analyst. Yes, the man testified the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. Were those prints the only ones? No, multiple partials including a full print from the defendant. Did you perform the analysis? No, I reviewed the report. Technician Lopez conducted the lift. Is Technician Lopez present? No, she moved apartments. Again, Imani stood. Were the prints smudged? Yes, some of them. Could they have come from touching the door? It's possible. Steering wheel prints suggest otherwise, but yes, it's possible. Was a chain of custody submitted? Not to my knowledge. She paused, then looked toward the jury. So we have no chain of custody, no original analyst, and no conclusive proof that I drove that vehicle. Objections rang out, but the jury had heard it. The words were planted like seeds. Mercer was starting to lose control of the rhythm. The case was no longer playing by his rules. During a recess, Imani sat alone, hands folded in her lap, back straight. Clarice sat 2 rows behind her eyes, locked on her daughter, with pride and worry dancing in her chest. Louisa Tran leaned over. They underestimated you. Imani didn't smile. They always do. Back in session, Mercer called the car's owner Terrence Whitaker. Terrence, a white man in his late 40s, seemed nervous on the stand. Can you describe the person who stole your vehicle? Mercer asked. Terrence paused. It was dark, but the person, I thought they were male. White, maybe Hispanic, hoodie, ran fast. Are you sure it wasn't the defendant? I didn't get a good look, but no, I don't think so. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mercer tried to clean it up, so you're not confident? I know who I saw, and it wasn't her. Mercer sat down with clenched jaws. Judge Warren looked up. For the first time, he was actually paying attention. Imani took her time walking to the center of the courtroom. She didn't speak yet. She let silence do its work. Then softly, clearly, this case is not about fingerprints. It's about perception. If I had been white, if I had been male, would we even be here? No one answered. She didn't need them to. The courtroom no longer felt certain. The murmurs had quieted. The air was still heavy. Even Judge Warren, who had once looked at Imani like a stubborn child playing dress-up in a grown man's arena, now sat forward in his chair, pen still, gaze fixed. Imani didn't move immediately. She sat, eyes closed for a moment, hearing the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. She was thinking, calculating, not just about how to protect herself, but how to expose what had almost gone unnoticed. When she opened her eyes, she stood. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but assertive, I would like to testify on my own behalf. Judge Warren looked over his glasses, surprised but intrigued. You understand the risks of self-incrimination. Yes, Your Honor. You may proceed. The bailiff swore her in. Imani walked slowly to the witness stand, every movement deliberate. She didn't fidget. She didn't show nerves. She sat upright, hands resting gently in her lap, and looked directly at the jury. She didn't need a lawyer to tell her how to speak the truth. She had lived it. Miss Brooks Mercer began, clearly uncomfortable. Where were you the evening of March 17th? I was leaving a tutoring session at Crenshaw Library. I help a group of 9th graders with math on Fridays. And on your way home, you encountered the car. Yes. Why did you touch the vehicle? The door was wide open. It looked like it had been left that way in a rush. I looked inside, called out, didn't see anyone. I closed it. That's it. And then you ran. I walked. 2 blocks later, someone shouted from behind me. I turned, then saw 2 officers running toward me. I panicked. I've seen what happens when people like me don't run fast enough or say the wrong thing. A quiet gasp broke out in the audience. Judge Warren rapped his gavel. Order in the courtroom. Mercer, frustrated, pushed forward. You expect this court to believe you just happened to touch a stolen car? I expect this court to follow the burden of proof. Mercer paused, thrown off. Imani turned to the jury. I'm not asking you to believe me because I speak well. I'm asking you to look at the facts. My prints were on the steering wheel, yes, but so were others. No video shows me stealing the car. The man who owns it said I didn't match the person he saw. The arresting officer wasn't even near the scene when the theft occurred. The fingerprint chain of custody is broken. There is no forensic expert here. And most importantly, she stopped, looked each juror in the eye. Most importantly, you've been told this story is simple. Because they want it to be. Because it's easier to believe that the young black girl in the wrong place is guilty than it is to ask why no one bothered to dig deeper. Mercer stood, objection grandstanding. Judge Warren hesitated but said, sustained, Miss Brooks, limit your statements to factual matters. Yes, Your Honor, she said, but her eyes stayed on the jury. She turned back to Mercer. May I ask you a question, Mr. Mercer? He blinked. This is cross-examination now. No, sir, just a simple question. If someone touches something and walks away, does that make them a criminal? He didn't respond. Because that's the entire case against me, she continued. I touched something. I didn't steal it. I didn't drive it. I didn't run with keys in hand. I closed a door. She leaned forward just slightly. If someone who looked different than me had done the same thing, would we be here? The jury was silent. Every face was frozen. Even Judge Warren didn't interrupt. Clarice watched from the gallery, one hand pressed against her chest. Her baby girl had always been strong, but this was something else. Imani looked at the court reporter. May I have something read back, Your Honor? Proceed, Warren allowed, intrigued. Imani handed over a printed transcript. Please read the testimony of Mr. Whitaker, line 27. The reporter read aloud. I saw a white man, maybe in his 20s. Short hair, hoodie, thin build. He took the car and ran. Whispers broke out again. Imani waited, then asked, Does that description fit me? No one answered. Mercer looked like he had swallowed broken glass. She turned to the judge. No further testimony, Your Honor. Imani stepped down and returned to her seat, shoulders squared. The energy in the room had shifted. What once felt like a performance of justice had become a confrontation with truth. Mercer returned to his seat slowly. He didn't call another witness. The case he had thought was ironclad now looked like something else entirely. Lazy biased, rushed. He knew it, and the jury knew it too. Judge Warren leaned over, looking visibly conflicted for the first time. He cleared his throat. Does the prosecution wish to rebut? Mercer's face hardened. No, Your Honor. Silence followed. Long, deep, almost spiritual in its weight. Judge Warren adjusted his glasses, stared down at the case file and then at Imani. Very well, he said slowly. This court will reconvene after a short recess to deliver its findings. The bailiff called for order. The judge stood and exited through the side door. As the courtroom emptied, Imani sat motionless. Clarice approached quietly, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You didn't just hold your own, she whispered. You held the mirror up. Imani looked up at her mother. They were never expecting me to fight back. No, baby, Clarice said, her voice trembling. They weren't expecting you to win. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. What Imani had just done wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about pulling back the curtain on a system that had assumed her guilt from the start, about standing where others had fallen and saying, not this time. And she hadn't needed to shout to do it. She had simply told the truth and made them listen. When the courtroom doors reopened after the recess, everything felt different. Gone was the snickering. Gone was the sense of certainty. The jurors filed back into their box more slowly this time, as if each step carried the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Mercer, once smug and quick to smirk, sat frozen. His arms were crossed, but his jaw was clenched. He looked like a man who had tripped over his own confidence. Imani sat quietly, hands resting in her lap, her posture straight. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't need it. She had already said what needed saying. Judge Elliot Warren emerged from the side chamber with his robe trailing like a shadow. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood behind his chair for a long pause, looking out at the courtroom. For a man who had previously dismissed Imani as a child playing dress-up, his expression had shifted into something new. Wary. Wiser. Maybe even humbled. He cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that the justice system rests on one core principle, the presumption of innocence. It is not a favor extended. It is a right. Today, we were all reminded how fragile that right can be. He took his seat. Miss Brooks, you have represented yourself with discipline and clarity. That does not automatically entitle you to a ruling in your favor, but it does demand respect. He turned to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? A gray-haired foreman stood. She was a retired schoolteacher, soft-spoken but firm. "Yes, Your Honor, we have. Please read the verdict." The clerk received the envelope and unfolded the slip of paper with careful fingers. "In the matter of the People versus Imani Brooks on the charge of grand theft auto, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." Gasps rippled through the room. The clerk continued. "On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty." And just like that, the entire courtroom exhaled. Imani didn't cry. She didn't collapse into her mother's arms. She just closed her eyes for a long moment as if letting herself fully believe it. Then she nodded once, slow and sure, and turned toward the jury. The black woman on the jury gave her a soft nod in return, silent but powerful. Mercer didn't say a word. He looked down at his files, then gathered them hastily. The collapse of his case was complete, and for the first time in years he had been publicly outmaneuvered, not by a high-powered attorney, but by a young black woman who knew the law better than he expected and lived it deeper than he could understand. Judge Warren tapped his pen again, but this time the rhythm was different, more thoughtful. "Miss Brooks, you are free to go. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. Imani stood slowly, deliberately. Her mother rose behind her, tears now running freely, though she wiped them quickly. She had told Imani once that strength wasn't just about how loud you could be. It was about knowing when silence could shatter walls. The two of them walked down the center aisle, not as victims, not even as just a mother and daughter, but as witnesses to something rare, a moment when the system blinked. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved into her face. "Miss Brooks, do you plan to sue the LAPD? Do you regret not taking a plea deal? Are you going to law school?" Imani said nothing. She just kept walking. Clarice walked beside her, protective as ever, until they reached the bottom of the marble stairs. There they paused. The city hummed around them, cars rushing by, people unaware of what had just unfolded in that courtroom above. Then a voice called out behind them, "Miss Brooks." They turned. Judge Warren had come down the steps. No robe now, just a plain dark suit and a face weathered by years on the bench. He approached slowly, awkwardly. "You should study law," he said without sarcasm this time. Imani didn't respond. Most lawyers don't talk like you," he added. "You spoke like someone who knew the weight of the room." Still, Imani said nothing. Warren sighed, nodding to himself. "You reminded us all that justice doesn't mean much if it only listens to the people it already believes." And with that, he turned and walked away. Clarice turned to her daughter, eyebrows raised. Imani finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I planned to be a lawyer before any of this," "I know," her mother said. "But now you've got a reason the world can't ignore." They stood in the sunlight, not triumphant, but changed. Not because a court had cleared her name, but because Imani had changed the court itself. Across the street in a coffee shop window sat two public defenders who had been watching the news feed on a phone. One of them, a young Latina woman, leaned in. "That girl just did in 3 days what we haven't been able to do in 10 years. The other nodded. She made the truth look easy, but it hadn't been easy. It had taken every ounce of strength of memory, of lived experience. It had taken years of learning the rules of a game rigged against her. It had taken watching her mother work twice as hard for half the credit. It had taken a lifetime of being told she was too loud, too smart, too bold for her own good. And still she had risen. The victory wasn't just that she walked free. It was that the system had been forced, however briefly, to see her, not as a stereotype, not as a case file, not even as a defendant, but as someone who belonged there. As someone who could hold it accountable, as someone who reminded them that justice isn't about who talks the loudest, it's about who speaks the truth when nobody wants to hear it. The evening sun dipped low over South Los Angeles, casting an amber glow across the buildings. Telephone wires and faded murals of freedom fighters painted decades ago. For the first time in weeks, the tension in Imani's chest had begun to fade, but she wasn't resting. She didn't know how. She sat on her front steps in Baldwin Hills, the same steps where she used to read her mother's old case files while other kids chalked hopscotch squares on the sidewalk. Clarice brought her a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside her without a word. They hadn't had to say much lately. Their language was unspoken, forged in shared glances and side-eye observations from across the courtroom. After a long moment, Clarice finally broke the silence. "I always knew you'd end up in court. I just didn't think it'd be that kind of court." Imani cracked the barest smile. "Me either." They sipped their tea, the quiet broken only by the distant sound of traffic and kids laughing down the block. But the world beyond their block wasn't quiet. That afternoon, clips of Imani's testimony had begun circulating online. A legal blogger had posted her closing cross-examination under the title, "The Girl Who Put Justice on Trial." By midnight, it had over 2 million views. People were talking. Not just legal experts, but everyday folks. Mothers, teachers, students, public defenders. They weren't just sharing the video, they were telling their own stories. Wrongful stops, racist judges, cases dropped for lack of evidence that were nearly convictions just the same. In a podcast episode recorded just hours after the verdict, a black female attorney in Chicago put it best. What Imani Brooks did wasn't just defend herself, she exposed the lazy violence of assumptions. That courtroom wasn't prepared to hear her, but she made them listen anyway. Some public defenders in LA had already clipped parts of the trial transcript to teach their interns. Law students in Oakland were writing papers about self-representation and systemic bias. Even a retired judge in San Francisco wrote an op-ed titled, "When the Bench is Humbled." None of that was Imani's doing. She wasn't chasing headlines. She just wanted to sleep again without hearing the slam of a cell door in her dreams. But Impact doesn't ask for permission. By the end of that week, she received over 70 emails from strangers, some offering to mentor her in law school, others just thanking her for speaking what they had lived. A grandmother from Detroit wrote, "My grandson was locked up for touching a bike that wasn't his. Your story gave me hope again." Imani read each one slowly, carefully holding them like fragile proof that she wasn't alone and never had been. One evening, Louisa Tron dropped by the house. She looked different, less flustered, more awake. "I came to apologize," she said at the door. "You were right to take the case into your own hands. I should have fought harder." Clarice stepped aside, letting her in. Imani nodded. "You weren't the problem," Imani said. "You're just working inside a machine that doesn't leave room for people like me." Louisa sighed. "I've got 6 new clients this week, all of them under 25, all of them black or brown, all of them offered deals they don't understand." Imani didn't say anything right away. Then she asked, "What if we started something?" Louisa blinked. "What kind of something?" "A clinic. Not legal aid the way they do it downtown. I mean real prep. Teaching young people their rights. Showing them how to speak in those rooms. Not to plead, but to resist." Louisa raised her eyebrows. "You serious?" Imani smiled. "Dead serious." From that day forward, the idea took shape. It didn't happen overnight, but by spring they had secured space in a rec center near Crenshaw. They called it the Front Table. The name came from something Clarice had always said when Imani was a girl. "If you don't get a seat at the front table, baby, they'll make your life into the menu." The Front Table became a space where kids could learn courtroom language the way others learned sports stats. They practiced mock hearings, they analyzed police body cam footage, they debated real legal cases like they were fighting for their futures because they were. And Imani She enrolled at Cal State LA in the fall pre-law. Took night classes, and interned at a civil rights firm by day. Every case she touched reminded her why her voice had to stay sharp. One afternoon she returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant but as an observer. She wore a navy blazer, clean lines, simple makeup. As she passed through the metal detectors, some officers nodded at her. Others looked away. Inside Department 105, Judge Warren was presiding over another small case. Misdemeanor battery. Imani sat quietly in the back watching, listening. At recess, Warren noticed her in the gallery. He didn't acknowledge her right away, but before stepping out, he paused. "Miss Brooks," he said softly. She looked up. "You still planning on law school?" "Already started." He gave a slow, solemn nod. "Good." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Because the girl who once stood alone at the defendant's table was now something more than a memory. She was part of the room now. A ghost in the gears, a name they wouldn't forget. Back at the front table, one of her students, a boy named Deshaun, asked her, "Miss Brooks, how do you know when to speak up in court?" She thought for a moment. "You speak when you're scared," she said. "You speak when they expect you to stay quiet. And most of all, you speak when it would be easier not to." That night, as she closed up the center, she looked out at the city lights. They weren't forgiving. They weren't gentle. But they were still burning. And so was she. 6 months after the verdict, the city of Los Angeles held a public hearing on judicial bias and misconduct. It wasn't on television. It didn't make national news. But it was standing room only, and tucked into the back row of the city council chamber sat Clarice Brooks, arms folded, watching her daughter testify again. This time, Imani wasn't on trial. This time she stood at the front of the room with a microphone clipped to her lapel and a file full of notes. She was there by invitation, called to speak about what it meant to survive a courtroom built to swallow you whole. She took no joy in the attention. She wasn't looking for applause, but she understood the moment for what it was: a window. A chance to say aloud what so many others never got the chance to. When you grow up black in America, she said to the room, you learn the law as something done to you, not for you. I learned early that being right didn't always matter. That truth could be drowned out by procedure. That courtrooms could feel more like traps than places of fairness. Some in the room nodded. Others didn't know where to look. But if the law only listens to those it already trusts, she continued, then justice is just performance. It was quiet when she finished. The kind of quiet that comes after someone has said what can't be unsaid. And yet things were shifting. In the months following her case, the LAPD quietly updated its field training protocol, adding mandatory review of wrongful arrest scenarios, including Imani's. Internal memos now cautioned officers against assuming ownership based on fingerprint presence alone. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was survival. The department didn't want another public relations mess like Brooks versus People. Local law schools began assigning the case as part of their criminal law curriculum. Students were required to study the transcript. One professor called it a modern-day example of the courtroom as both a weapon and a mirror. But perhaps the biggest shift happened outside the institutions, in the streets, the schools, the living rooms, where people talked quietly over dinner about what happened to that girl who beat the court. One such room belonged to Patricia Hunt, a retired public defender now teaching part-time at a local community college. She'd spent her life arguing cases, many of them like Imani's, but rarely with an ending that gave her peace. I used to think the law was a grindstone, she told her students, wearing us all down slowly. Then I saw what that girl did and I realized, sometimes the stone cracks first. And in a modest legal clinic off Slauson Avenue, the front table had become more than an after-school program. It had evolved into a community-run legal literacy initiative. Word had spread. Folks were showing up from Watts Compton, even Inglewood kids, parents, formerly incarcerated men who wanted to understand what went wrong when they were young. The center ran workshops on courtroom language, taught teens how to read police reports, and even created mock trials where local judges volunteered as moderators. Not all of them welcomed the scrutiny, but some were curious, even open. One Friday afternoon, a boy named Elijah raised his hand during a mock trial session. What if the judge already thinks you're guilty before it starts? Imani nodded slowly, then walked to the whiteboard. You still speak, she said, because the record matters. Your words get written down. And one day someone who wasn't ready to listen might read them and have to. Clarice watched from the back of the room. She'd become something of a legend among the volunteers, a quiet backbone. Parents often approached her for advice. Her calm strength reassured them. One mother asked her, "How'd you raise a daughter who could stand up to all that?" Clarice smiled. I taught her to think like a lawyer and feel like a poet. Meanwhile, back in the downtown courthouse, something else was happening. Judge Elliot Warren had begun requesting full evidentiary packets before hearings. It slowed things down, annoyed the clerks, but he insisted. I'd rather be thorough than wrong, he muttered once under his breath, which was the closest anyone ever heard him admit that Imani's case had shaken him. He started asking more questions in open court, not about guilt, but about process. Where's the body cam? Why isn't the witness here? Is there chain of custody on that evidence? The attorneys noticed. One seasoned prosecutor called it the Brooks effect. But not everyone approved. There were those who saw Imani's case as a fluke, a media stunt, a dangerous precedent. One morning, a conservative columnist wrote, "Letting defendants represent themselves just encourages courtroom theatrics. We're not here for performance, we're here for justice." Imani never responded publicly, but her students did. One of them, Deshaun, the same kid who'd asked when to speak in court, wrote a letter to the editor. If justice is afraid of someone telling their story, maybe justice needs to get braver. The letter went viral. At a barbershop near Crenshaw, a man in his 60s told the whole waiting room that girl reminded them that the courtroom ain't a theater, but it ain't a factory either. It's supposed to be a place for the truth. The echoes kept coming. Years later, young public defenders would still talk about Brooks Verge. People like a campfire tale, a legend, a signal that the system wasn't unmovable, just resistant, and that sometimes, just sometimes, a quiet voice and a stubborn will could split it open. But for Imani, the noise faded. She kept her head down, stayed in school, and showed up at the front table every Tuesday and Thursday. She didn't seek out attention, she just made space for others. When asked how she stayed so calm, she said, "Because I've already walked into a storm and come out whole." And when asked what she wanted people to remember, she said that justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in who they believe when the story starts. Years from now, people won't remember every detail of the case. They won't all recall the courtroom number, the exact date, or the names of the lawyers. But they'll remember the feeling of watching Imani Brooks stand up alone and demand to be seen. They'll remember the silence that fell when she asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" They'll remember how uncomfortable it got, not because she was wrong, but because she was right and they weren't ready to hear it. That silence. That was the loudest thing justice had ever heard in that room, and it echoed. Into classrooms, into courtrooms, into kitchens, barbershops, and buses. It made people look again. It made people remember what truth looks like when it doesn't ask for permission. Imani didn't come from power. She didn't wear the badge. She wasn't handed a microphone or invited behind closed doors. She was a young black woman in a system that had made its mind up about her before she even spoke. But she spoke anyway. And that's what changed everything. So, if you're watching this now, listening to her story, don't let it sit quiet in your heart. Don't just admire it. Act. Because for every Imani, there are hundreds of others still standing alone at defense tables, their voices muffled by fear, by lawyers with too many cases, by judges who don't look up, by a system that runs faster than it listens. Speak up. Stand with them. Share their stories. Teach them what you know. Correct the lies when you hear them. Challenge the assumption that someone who knows their rights must be arrogant. And remember this. Justice that only listens to those in power is not justice at all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it opened your eyes, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the Black Women channel. We tell stories that don't just speak truth, but demand it. Stories that lift up the overlooked, honor the fighters, and refuse to whisper when it's time to shout. Because someone out there needs to know you can speak back, you can win, you can be heard. This is for the ones who never had a seat at the table. We're building new tables now. And we're saving you a chair.